Welcome to what promises to be a very insightful and futuristic exploration into legal challenges that will face us in the age of robotics. The age of robotics is actually here already, in case you didn't realize. My name is Marianne Williams, and you've been watching my robot soccer team playing. The robots are totally autonomous. They're not remote controlled. They make all the decisions on board. They have a camera in their nose, and they just basically take they take an image every 25 milliseconds, and they process that image, determine how far away the ball is. They fight other robots for the ball, and they try to kick goals, and I'm sure you've probably seen a couple of goals already. But the main point is they are autonomous, and there are rules that say, for example, if a robot intentionally gets in front of another robot that is trying to get the ball, it's penalized. The robots are taken off the field. Of course, determining when a robot is intentionally doing anything is a challenge. And some of you may be familiar with Herb Simon. He's very famous scientist from CNU, and when he first saw robots playing soccer, he posed the question, well, will one day robots be watching robots play soccer?
Yes.
Yes, very good. We won't have a show of hands on that one. Okay, well, basically before we get started, I just have a couple of words to say about the sponsors. That is the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, and in particular Codex, that I'm affiliated with. So there are two centers in the law school that focus on computers and law in that space. Codex is very unique and special because it crosses two faculties, engineering and law. And while Codex is interested in the societal issues of technology, we are even more interested in designing technology that respects the law. So when it comes to robotics, we are interested in how you design the mind of a robot such that it reasons and is law-abiding. Okay? So we wanted to make sure that you got that message. And now I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for coming. This is so wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic. I'm really excited about it, and some of us are really excited about it at Stanford, but you just never know the level and depth of people's excitement. Every time I have a conversation about this field, people are just so interested and have so much to say about it. So thanks a lot. I'm actually with the Center for Internet and Society. We sort of are on the other side of that divide that Marianne mentioned, in the sense that we look at the repercussions of technology for society as a whole and for the law. And in looking at this space, you find that too often the law really reacts in a kind of haphazard way to changes in technology. And then in some cases, in extreme cases, it becomes kind of a matter of chance whether the conditions for innovation and safety and even, in a sense, basic morality are achieved. With some notable exceptions, I think, I'd say we kind of lucked out with both the internet and personal robotics in really meaningful ways, and that it evolved in a way that actually was, where conditions for innovation were possible and the like. So with computers and the internet, robotics is, in panelist Paul Sappho's words, the next big thing. I think he used the word guaranteed. So we'll ask him a little bit about that, about the state of the guarantee. But I'll tell you, statistics certainly bear Paul's prediction out. It's also, incidentally, the prediction of Bill Gates. A recent UN report predicts tens of millions of personal and service robotics as compared to military or industrial factory robotics to be worldwide. Given the widespread use of robots even today, we're already beginning to grapple with questions of what legal challenges robots raise, or at least we should be. And so to that end, we've assembled 3 panelists with deep expertise in various relevant fields and a keen interest in artificial intelligence and robotics. So I just want to introduce them real quick, and then we'll right into questions. So Professor Ken Anderson is a professor of law at American. He's the director of their JD MBA program. And he's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, Peace at Stanford University. He's expert in, among other things, international law and armed conflict. He's written about the use of robotics in warfare, including recently in a book chapter. And he has given talks on this subject here at Stanford and at Harvard Law School, the Stanford of the East. People might know that, among other places.
Aspires to be a Stanford of the East.
So we're very excited to have him here to talk about his expertise. Then Dan Siciliano is an associate dean and senior lecturer here at the law school. He is a recognized expert in a number of things, but among them corporate governance, having recently been named to the Directorship 100, so a list of the most influential people in corporate governance. He has testified. He has testified as an expert both in the House and the Senate. I don't believe on the subject of robotics, but on interesting other things. Maybe one day soon. And he's actually founded a software automation and design company, Law Logics Group, which has been named to the Inc. 500 list, I think more than once. Finally, we're very excited to have Paul Saffo here. He's a technology forecaster and essayist with decades of experience exploring long-term technological change and its practical impact on business and society. He teaches at Stanford University. He's a visiting scholar at the Stanford Media X Research Network. He's a columnist for abcnews.com, and his essays have appeared in many, many places, Fortune, Wired, Newsweek, New York Times, Washington Post, many other places. He's also an alumnus, I'm proud to say, of the law school here at Stanford. So thank you very much to everybody for coming. So with that, into robotics and the law. So my first question's for you, Ken. We keep hearing how the military is the sort of first adopter here with robotics, and it's undergoing this robotics revolution with these thousands of drones deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But a lot of these seem to be these teleoperated robots that just kind of find and defuse bombs. And my question, I guess, to start off as a skeptic was, does this really implicate international law?
Well, I guess the question about where robotics is going on the battlefield is one that starts with something that is this kind of diffusing of bombs, or sort of Robbie the robot goes out to check and see whether this thing is a suspicious thing that could blow up. So far and away the most important use of these things so far in the military has been for IED detection. And so the question that will arise is, where does it go next? And then it winds up moving from there into things like the Predator surveillance systems. And one of the things that's very important to understand about that is that although the name of the aircraft is a Predator, it did not get started as a weaponized thing. It was started, and its overwhelmingly still most important use is as a surveillance mechanism. You load it up with cameras, and it glides around and can stay up for a really long time, and is mostly about surveillance. And so the question of how you move from things that are about surveillance and about battlefield vehicles that are remotely piloted by somebody that's not actually sitting on the battlefield. The question is how you move from that, and whether one should move, or how one moves and whether one should move, into questions of what you had up here on the screen of genuinely autonomous little puppy dogs out there kicking the ball around. That then turn, and it turns out that they're actually weapon systems which are making decisions about whether or not to fire a weapon. Are they able to have some kind of logic which builds on the soccer-playing puppy dogs into something which is able to make decisions about the identification of targets on the one hand and the assessment of the levels of collateral damage on the other? That's, I take it, the sort of stream that we're looking at, and so I'd say that we're just starting into that journey. And I guess I'd say also, Ryan, that one of the things that's interesting to me about this is my focus is generally on the battlefield. It's on war robots, it's on that. One of the things that I become aware of in the course of preparing for this panel, which makes this panel enormously important to me in my thinking about this, is to start to realize that many of the battlefield decisions will turn out to be ones which are also involved in other kinds of uses of robots and other kinds of settings that they're used in. So I think the war robotics setting is very, very important for sort of setting a certain kind of stage, but it turns out that many of the questions that are going to be asked are going to be also questions raised by these other areas.
So as a follow-on, though, I mean, are there things that are happening right now with robotics in the military that have implications for the laws of conflict as they exist right now? Or is it just something that's around the corner?
The question of targeted killing, so in other words, the question of taking a predator that cruises around, strapping a Hellfire missile onto it and using it as an aiming weapon to go after somebody in particular, raises an enormous number of legal issues at this point. Issues that are being now sort of contested, debated, and it's not very clear where those are going to go. I mean, as a political matter, the Obama administration is committed more than anybody else is really in the world to the use of targeted killing from remote platforms as a weapon of war and as a weapon of the use of force without necessarily having to get into a war either. And I guess I would say that the both legal and ethical question which is raised here is the whole history of warfare when it comes to the question of trying to make weapons more and more discriminant essentially is one that says a physical human being has to get close to the target and cut his throat. Okay. Robotics breaks that pattern, that where we're headed with predators with missiles attached, we got a fair amount of collateral damage at this point, but it's nowhere near what the Pakistani army causes when it sort of blasts an entire valley with artillery and levels every building in the place. Two entirely different propositions in terms of collateral damage. But what we're working towards is targeted killing in which the connection between having to physically get a human being close to the target is broken, that you're actually able to target individual targets from a genuinely remote standoff platform. That's what the Predator represents as far as the forward-looking direction of technology. And the issue today is, does that violate any form of international law? And I'd say that the issue is hotly debated. The position of the U.S. Government, not just the military, not just the Obama administration, the position of the U.S. government has always been that this does not. And I'd say that's the position of most governments around the world, but I'd say that there are also a lot of currents in international law which are raising questions about that. And if you're asking me what in terms of military stuff is the question, this is the question of current technology and the question of current law.
So I guess why doesn't that cut the other way, right? So if you're able to get this drone out there and fire off a missile with incredible accuracy, to the extent that the international laws of war have to do with proportionality of response and with limiting collateral damage, why doesn't a robotic system like this that's able to pinpoint actually solve a lot more problems than it creates?
I guess in my view it does, but I come from this from a very particular perspective. I started out work in this area for human rights organizations in which I was involved in essentially weapons questions. And so that was in the late 80s and 1990. And so I was going around to military weapons designers, having been involved in launching the anti-landmines campaign during that period, and saying, you guys have got to get with the program here, and the program is not how big an explosion you can cause. The program is how discriminating you can make what it is you do, how narrowly you can target, and you got to start designing weapons in that way. And so when I look backwards over that process, I say what you just said and say, wow, they've actually cut a couple of zeros off what is counted as collateral damage in this way. I think that's pretty darn good. Now, I also understand if you don't have that sort of 25-year perspective to look back at and say, what was I asking for 25 years ago? You're just looking at it on today's terms and today's standards. You look and say, yeah, but there were 25 civilians blown up in that thing. That's terrible. All right? and maybe illegal. And so there is this sort of difference in perspective of, do you see the glass as being half full or half empty, or 90% full and 10% empty? How do you wind up seeing that trade-off? And the concern I guess I would raise about this would be that I see it as a gradual incremental improvement in targeting standards by the use of better and better technology in this. But those improvements are produced on an incremental basis. Now I want you to think for a second, if you applied a rule of legal liability to that and said anybody who's involved in sort of developing this stuff is liable for any kind of collateral damage that's produced by this, what's the effect of that going to be? And it will be, as with many other legal areas in which you've imposed strict liability on whoever is developing this stuff, you simply won't get any more development out of it, and least of all, in circumstances in which the improvements come on an incremental basis, right? Very tiny improvements, all of which look like they're going to be liable. And the answer is, I don't think I'm getting involved in that area. I don't think that investors are going to want to put the money in. And so I think that there's probably a real question about what kinds of legal regulation are appropriate in an area in which there are real possibilities that you could kill off what would have to be regarded as improvements in a humanitarian sense.
Figuratively speaking, kill off.
Sorry.
So yeah. So my question then becomes: there was an incident a few years ago involving, I believe it was a South African roboticized gun, and this thing just went on the fritz and took out a lot of people, and that's a scary, scary thing. So if that kind of thing happens with, God forbid, with U.S. robotic technology soon, can you go after the manufacturer and say you got a glitch there?
Yeah, the South African thing was a big gun, I mean a really big machine gun, mounted on top of a vehicle. And the basic idea was that you're going to have a sort of joystick that would be able to sort of run this vehicle around, and then there would be a way to switch into weapons mode, and then you could control remotely where this thing pointed to. Okay, so in other words, it's not autonomous. It's not doing anything on its own. It's following instructions from somebody who's got a little controller in their hand. Somehow something goes wrong, and not entirely clear what happens, but the thing starts spinning around and just spraying 50, this is a 50 millimeter machine gun, and it's just spraying stuff everywhere, and there are like 20 soldiers killed in the first 3 seconds, and just it runs out of bullets. Right? This is bad. The question is, how do you regard that? Do you regard that as it's a product recall issue? I mean, this is a famous quote from Peter Singer's work on this from an engineer. Do you regard this as something where there should be somebody held liable for this? Now, the answer with weapons is actually pretty straightforward, at least in U.S. law. U.S. law basically protects any manufacturer, developer, designer under a general sort of principle of government contractor immunity, with a very special principle of government contract immunity in defense work where weapons design is the whole point of it. You can't even go after them for things that mess up and wind up killing your own people. So you're really, really, really protected there. The strange part is that that's the area where you are actually most protected in terms of the design of stuff, the ability to look for incremental improvements, the ability to take the chance on something that might jam and sort of kill half of you folks out there, that you couldn't possibly do if you were outside of the military design area, that it wouldn't survive for a second, I would say, in other areas.
So thank you. That's extremely interesting, and it's such a vivid example of this thing spinning around and going out of control. It's just incredible. So then I guess I want to move on to Dan here then and talk a little bit outside of the military conflict. So Kenneth just said that the nature of government contracts apparently absolves the manufacturer. But sort of, I guess my question is, what happens when we get out of the military context? Like, what happens when we get out of the battlefield and into the real world? It actually sounds like the opening to the real world. Like, what happens when we stop and start getting real? But what if, as predicted, we see lots and lots of robots out there in real, in society? What are the issues of liability?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is it's a lot of old law just put on its head periodically and looked at in different ways. And I think it's early enough for me to kind of disclaim, I don't know whether this is the right way to frame these ideas, or even if, framing them, if you conclude this is a good idea, bad idea, right path. And I think we'll probably change our minds several times over the next few years as we actually have experience. And so that's the first issue, is I think there's basically almost no foundation on which to evaluate certain things. But let's walk through a few of them. So, first there's the easy ones where, and I'm using a very loose definition of robot, and I think Paul might expand on kind of how to box in some of these ideas. But, I'm just using the basic notion of sense, think, act, so the kind of the Singer permutation. And you first have simple liability that arises when things run into other things. So you have kind of a basic property damage. That's easy to imagine. Let's envision the Roomba, make it 10 times bigger, have it trim hedges, have it fall over and scrape a car up. Okay, there you are. So that's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's anything really dramatic about that, other than it'll take us a while to sort out who to point the finger at, and I'll come back to that. But take it to another step, and you have personal injury possibilities, right? So that's just kicking up a level. But then you have a lot of other issues that arise in kind of the other direction. That's where it's more interesting to me, and that is, what if you have a robotic device? What if you have an agent that does things for you, and it gets damaged? So at the basic level, there's just a property damage issue. So I kind of frame this as is it the Harley Davidson or the monkey? And there's so let me expand on that. There is case law that goes something like, your truck just ran over my Harley Davidson, and my Harley Davidson is a beloved machine. It has scratches and dents and history and memory, and it means a lot to me. And not only that, it purred in this particular way, which no other Harley Davidson has ever purred, right? And it turns out that that's too bad. Right? I'm sorry, the best you're going to get is a new Harley Davidson, and all those memories, just keep them in your head. And as to the purring thing, I can't hear it, right? So that's just property damage. But you go in the other direction, and then you have kind of the monkey. And let me substitute a robot in this story and see where we land. And that is, you have something, a device, not to disparage monkeys, but a device that does something. And let's say it's an ice sculptor machine that has some AI components to it, and it evolves and fine-tunes itself, and it adapts to the density of the ice, and so on and so forth. And you're a wedding planner, and you paid $50,000 for this thing, and or a wedding guy who runs weddings, and every day before the wedding starts, you get the big block of ice, and you set it in front of it, you press a button, you come back in an hour, and you gave it certain parameters. It's really cool. It works out really well. And over time, you had two of these, and you developed a favorite. Right? This one it was better. People liked whatever it produced better, and it had certain things about it. That gets run over in the parking lot. And the question is it more like the special trained monkey that is irreplaceable, and you get kind of, it's the wrong legal term, but you get a sort of weird loss of consortium, right? You have this, but the thing,
Wow.
Yeah, sorry. The thing that I liked about it, the kind of unique nature, isn't captured in the property value. It's the loss of ability, and do you get loss of ability to perform? So you ran over my ice machine, and now my ice won't get carved out today. So I think the interesting liability stuff will be sorted out, but what I think is most interesting is, will we treat robotic entities as property, which are simply a sum of things, or can we treat them as unique, losses of value that are not capturable? So that's, and there's a lot more to the liability story.
So so I want to push back on the first part, but before I do that, so if I understand your story, you're saying that with the trained monkey, you actually might be able to recover, especially because you've done the trouble of training this thing. And in some extent, I understand from speaking to roboticists such as Marianne and others, that a lot of robots getting good at things has to do with this sort of doing the motion. It's this machine learning issue where over time it sort of gets it right. And you're suggesting that that actually may...
The loss is more than the items.
Just
the
the
loss
item.
is the item plus the applicable skills, and in combination, there's a
Right.
cost to re-achieve that. And in the process, you might have some incidental damages that say for the year it takes me to get my new ice machine to really get good at this. I've got loss of revenue because I'm no longer the great ice guy. And so there's an established pattern to. Well, inevitably, all these examples are silly, but someday we'll have real ones. And we can
Right,
use
well, I mean,
those. But yeah.
Yeah, we do have, I mean, for instance, we have musicians who use artificial intelligence programs, and they work with them over many, many, many years already. And so I don't think, I mean, and if someone were to sort of pull the plug on it, that might do the same thing. But I wanted to ask you a little follow-up on the immunity issue. So I don't know that I'm convinced that these liability issues when the robot does damage will be so easily solved, and here's why.
Sure.
So you have this sort of this idea that some robots you just teleoperate, and you run into somebody's fence or car, and you can say, okay, I blame you because you teleoperated this thing. Other things are you program. You tell it to do a number of different things. Other things you just instruct. Other things they learn from context and they evolve. The point of the matter is that the robot is just this thing that has all these different ways in order to do it. And I wonder, how do you separate, how do you parse whether it's responsibility of the human owner, of the manufacturer, and then even maybe how do you share responsibility among the robot eventually as a intervening agent?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple things. One, we don't yet have a full rubric to kind of chop this up into noble pieces. And I'll throw out a couple, and I suspect Paul will add to this in some ways. But first, let me, again, I had the Harley Davidson the monkey. Let's try the truck and the temporary employee, right? So there's this range where, is your robot a truck? It's just a truck. It's a machine, and if you leave the truck and you leave it off park and it rolls down a hill and runs into things, I mean, we know how to handle that, right? So there's negligence standards, and you're responsible and you're the owner, and on the other hand, there's a temp, right? So there's a temporary employee, and we have this notion of respondeat superior. So the employer is responsible for what the employee does, but not if the employee is doing things that aren't related to the task at hand, if it's outside the scope of employment. So that gets a little bit more complicated. It gets all mashed up in robotics. So a couple thoughts. One, I think the range of device and product liability goes from common carrier. So you're an airline and you run a common carrier, good luck escaping any real liability. So you've got kind of a type of strict liability, all the way to software that's shrink wrapped. So software not intended for a specific purpose, not warranted for any purpose. I don't know if any of you have successfully sued, say, Microsoft for the crash that erased your 2 chapters. If you have, talk to me. You don't get any. So there's this range, and I think the way to think about it is to try to guess where we will assign, because of this sort of nexus and affinity to the action, certain types of natural liability. And I take this is kind of a non-lawyerly view, but if you line up a bunch of people, either politicians, policy folks, or folks on the street, and you say, which makes sense, what might they think? I think it might sort out into 3 categories. You'll have the platform, right? So there's a robotics platform. It's either the device, it's the machine, and I think that's going to be viewed very much as a truck. And over time, I think then you'll have kind of this software layer, and I'm not sure we'll call it that, but let's call it a software layer, where there's a certain amount of greater responsibility. But again, I think it's just going to be a part of it. And then I think there will be specific applications. And the application sitting on top, I think, is where those on the production side of robotics may see certain amounts of responsibility and liability. If you say, this machine holds the hand of a child and crosses the street again and again very, very successfully, you've got the machine, you've got an operating system perhaps of some sort, and then you have the application, which is child crossing safely. If the child crossing safely part is screwed up, has a flaw that is discovered later, I think there's something there. It seems to me we don't want, and maybe it's my bias, we don't want the robot itself. You don't want to go back to the manufacturer of the machine, the metal parts and the pieces, and say, shame on you for allowing people to load up an application that then crossed in the street and bad things happen. I think that would be bad for the industry. I think it would be bad generally. But I think it'll break into those kind of pieces.
So then a sort of third component of potential component of liability would be a situation where robots are perceived to be really, really good at something, right? So my understanding of the robot story is that they're really terrible at like doing easy stuff that like we can just do with no problem at all. But they're really, really good at doing really some stuff that we find to be terribly, terribly hard. One example where this is sort of already unfolding is, sort of automated flying. I mean, I've heard the example of flying before and increasingly driving. Should we require that robots be doing something in some circumstances? Should we get upset if they don't?
Well, so there's a whole different universe of liability, which I think is interesting and emerges, and I'll answer the question you're asking, then maybe there's a separate one. The separate one first, which is, how in the world did the guy who does corporate governance land in the robotics panel? And it's because I was interested in what happens when you set up systems that look at lots of data and come back to moderately sophisticated but non-expert people and say things like, you know what? The pattern of emails with your internal audit and your product safety group is really, really strange, right? and without even reading the emails, you can do analysis of the headers and the patterns among certain people. You can match them to outside events, and you can say, there's some red flags here, right? So you've been told there's no interesting issues happening in product liability, and yet 3 people in internal audit keep having these weird conversations after hours via email. We don't even know what the emails say with the product liability people. Why is that? So red flag goes up the poll to somebody, maybe on the board, whatever, and here's an interesting question. If you get really good at doing this and you feel strongly that you can rely on the systems that red flag certain behaviors and activities, and then you say, it's just a machine and you ignore it, and you were wrong. And it turns out that there's a terrible problem, there was a huge cover-up, and that's exactly what the system was telling you, and you chose to ignore it. Do you have some sort of weird new liability? Well, in the corporate governance context, it's hard to attach liability to, say, for example, independent directors. You got this huge business judgment rule. You've got a lot of room to maneuver. You can say, look, in my business judgment, I paid a lot of attention. I read all the reports, and I said, I just don't like machines. You probably wouldn't have liability. But that said, fast forward that to a pilot or a doctor, and you have a system that is assistive. It has parameters, and it says you're pushing the parameters. Listen, you're really pushing the parameters. Are you aware that you're about to do something that no one's ever actually successfully done? Would you please stop, right? And the question is, what happens if you then say, screw it, I'm doing it anyway? And then we have 2 questions of liability. One, you say, screw it, I'm doing it anyway, people die. What's at issue there? Or, more like Airbus A320 of interest, right? So fly-by-wire is very controversial for pilots at a certain level because there are, within certain parameters, and I think a book has just come out or about to come out by this. I think it might even be called Fly-by-Wire. I heard it mentioned on NPR today. There are constraints, hard constraints. So it's not going to let you push way beyond certain parts of the envelope. Hardly ever going to get there, by the way, but what if somehow it's wrong? What if it turns out, and it was an A320, and it turns out that the pilot's skill really did matter, and if it was a 737, probably it would have worked out well, but landing on the Hudson, what if it turns out that there was, and I would say this would have been a mistake, a parameter that said you can't land on something that isn't there, and it misread the Hudson as not being there to land on, and it said, obviously you're drunk, unconscious, or a terrorist, and so I'm going to take over, and we're going to try to land somewhere where you can land. Now, I would say that river landings are a known emergency operation, so that wouldn't have been an example, but what if there was something like that? And the pilot said, but damn it, I was right, and boom, people die. So that's the other side of the liability. What's that mean? I think the one takeaway is hard stops, carefully designed, 99.9% of the time, they work, right? I mean, people are more likely to make the mistake. The question is, what about that 0.1% of the time? Is that an acceptable parameter? That was 2 questions.
2 questions, yeah. I thought I anticipated another one. So what about that? Paul, I saw you. I mean,
Paul's eyebrows are going.
he was going up. I wanted to
Well, I just
please
want
go
to
ahead.
build on some comments Daniel made. The issue of parameterization of robotic autonomy on aircraft is fascinating. The difference between Airbus and Boeing is that Airbus builds its planes as plane-centric systems, so that the plane can override the pilot. Boeing builds its planes as pilot-centric systems. This is why I don't fly Airbus ever.
But their safety record thus far isn't widely
we
convergent.
still-
Interesting. I don't know what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, but the other fascinating thing is, to the example of, is there something that today experts aren't allowed to do that robots do much better? You all have probably experienced it. I can't name the name of the airline, unfortunately, but there is a major global airline on this planet that says to the pilots, you can only land the airplane yourself when the weather is good. When the weather is bad, you are not allowed to land the plane manually. Only the plane's autopilot can land itself. So we are already into the zone where highly trained experts are told to keep their hands off, the knobs and buttons.
This explains an answer. So there's a running joke, I'm a pilot. There's a running joke among pilots where when you land and it's bumpy or bad or really good, as you're walking out, if there's a pilot, co-pilot, you say, so Navy or Air Force, right? Because there's this like Navy guys, they land it better.
Don't fly Air Force.
Right.
Navy,
So there's a
only
joke, right? So you say Navy or Air Force. And not very long ago, I got an answer which said machine. And I thought he was just talking assistive, right? But maybe he meant machine. That's interesting.
So actually, why don't we put
Could make
it?
a note of that.
No, please, yeah.
There's one other cognate to this out of the war battlefield stuff, which is, I don't know where the technology is going to wind up in terms of battlefield systems and robots, but one of the things that has crossed my mind is that exactly parallel to these kinds of situations, it may be that 100 years from now we might be in a situation in which we've built robotic battlefield systems that we actually trust far better than human soldiers to make decisions about when to fire and when not to fire. And who knows where the technology will actually go and whether it would achieve that. I don't know. Nobody here really can tell. But I could imagine circumstances 100 years from now in which the war crimes trial would be, why did you insist on having a human in the loop rather than letting the machine make the decision? You are going to be charged with war crimes for having not have the machine do it.
For interfering, for getting into the mix
getting into it.
and causing something. So I want to shift gears a little bit, if we could, and I kind of want to put Paul to the test here. So are we really? Is it much ado about nothing? That is, you've predicted very publicly that that robots really are the next big thing, and you're in good company, right? So as I said in the intro, Bill Gates said not very long ago in an op-ed that we're at the place right now, today, that we were with personal computers in the 80s.
Caused me to reconsider it. I might be
Yeah.
mistaken.
So what's your evidence? I guess.
So
what's your evidence? I guess is the
here's the
question.
context.
Yeah.
It's not only that robots are the next big thing, but robots are climbing onto the curve of Moore's law, that marvelous thing that means that if you are still old, some people in this room look old enough to still wear a watch. My students remind me it's only what geezers do. And if it's electronic, you're wearing more computing power on your wrist than existed in the entire world combined before about 1979. The context for robots. In the 80s, each decade has been shaped by a different technology. The advent of cheap microprocessors in the 1970s ushered in a decade of the 1980s that was the processing decade. That was the entire focus. And the poster child was the personal computer. Evidence that processors were so cheap you could have one on everybody's desk. The 90s were shaped by a different technology, and that was cheap communications lasers that arrived in about 86, 87. And it ushered in a decade defined not by processing, but by access. If in the 80s our machines were defined by what they processed for us, in the 90s, they were defined by what they connected us to. And the poster child of that access decade was the World Wide Web. This decade, despite all the stuff about social media and Web 2.0 and semantic net, this decade is actually being shaped by a third technology, and that's cheap sensors. RFID chips in packaging, ever more ubiquitous video cameras and the like. And so it's a decade. In the 80s, we invented our computers. In the 90s, we networked them together, and we created cyberspace. And in this decade, we've handed them eyes, ears, and sensory organs, and we're asking them to observe and manipulate the world on our behalf. And we have already all become a little bit like Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire. I have always relied upon the kindness of strangers. But several times a day, your life is utterly dependent on either a physical robot or a software bot. But basically, we built the computers, we networked them together, we allow them to observe the world on our behalf. All you need to do is put wheels on them and it looks like a robot. But the most important robots in our lives will be the ones that we don't see and never even guess existed until they fail. And the only other thing I'd say is today's robots are really dumb, but that curve of Moore's law, when you start looking at what's happening in AI, it's coming up fast. Can I give one other example?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
The DARPA Grand Challenge. 2004 May, out in the desert. Pentagon had a little problem. Everything went fine in Iraq until somebody decided to drive a convoy somewhere, and then everybody got all shot up. It worked a lot better if they stayed at their bases. So DARPA said, well, this is great. Let's get the troops out of the trucks, and let's have a robot convoy. And they spent about $1 billion trying to build this over a couple of decades and utterly failed. They set up the Grand Challenge, May 2004, 150-mile course, 106 entrants, 21 finalists. I was there, and it was like Monty Python. None of the robots, most of them died at the gate. It's like, and the one that got furthest only got 7 miles or 7 kilometers in before it died on the side of the road. I felt pretty stupid. I was sitting in a helicopter halfway through the race, supposedly doing support, and all dressed up and nowhere to go. 18 months later, one doubling period of Moore's Law, we had the second DARPA Grand Challenge in 2005. 23 entrants, finalists in that race. 21 of the entrants got farther than the robot got farthest in the first race. 5 robots finished. I'm proud to say Stanford won. Sebastian Thrun, professor here, head of our AI lab, he set up CS294. As he puts it, 41 students showed up on the first day, half dropped out, and the 20 who remained built the robot that won that race in 2 months. But the most telling was the third DARPA Grand Challenge, which was the Urban Grand Challenge in 2007 on an Air Force base up in the Mojave Desert that simulated a town. And the robots had to complete the race and obey all the rules of the California Vehicle Code, driving through a simulated city with some very brave people driving cars and playing the role of pedestrians. And in that race, the robots actually did win the race and demonstrated they understood the California Vehicle Code better than most Californians. But the ultimate irony, which for me as a forecaster is just delicious, was 30 minutes before that race began down in the Mojave, 250 miles to the north on Highway 99, just outside of Fresno, there was a 108 vehicle pileup of cars driven by humans going over the speed limit despite the fog so thick they couldn't see over the hood of their cars. I spoke to one of the paramedics working on that, and he said it was the eeriest thing. As we were working on extricating people in the front, we could hear the people smashing into the back of this thing. It is proof people shouldn't drive. Our robots are, as Sebastian Thrun says, by 2030, half of all vehicle miles driven in this country will be driven by robots. It's already begun. We have cars you can buy today that parallel park better than 99% of humans. So do not underestimate how fast this stuff is going to advance.
So that's interesting. So that's a big upside, right? And it's interesting as an emerging theme from this panel is that there's a lot of interesting upside. There's also the ability to finally target and war and the like. But what do you see? I mean, is it all a big rosy picture? Is it all great, or what should we be worried about anything?
This scares the bejesus out of me.
Oh, it does scare you. Okay.
By the way, it's going to create interesting urban planning issues. If you are actually being, robotically driven somewhere by your robotic car, it doesn't have to park next to the Walmart. It could go drive 3 miles away and have a cigarette with its robot friends. So what are we going to do with parking spaces? The scariest thing, the stereotype scary is, when robots get super intelligent. And some people think I mean, that could happen fairly fast. Maybe it won't happen at all, but the optimists say by 2030, you know, and you all are familiar with the Turing test. This is the test of intelligence, a machine that's indistinguishable from humans. Personally, I think the real thing about the Turing test is we're going to discover that a lot of our friends don't pass. So intelligence is a red herring. The robots to be very frightened of are the little dumb automated software bots on the net. The things that run program trading in companies, the things that control the traffic lights in our cities, the things that make decisions about mortgages. If you applied for a mortgage lately, it was untouched by human hands. It was a really dumb piece of autonomous software that decided whether you got your mortgage or not. The bots that are running things like MRI machines. That's the scary part. I actually suspect that a major company in this country will go bankrupt sometime in the next 20 years because of an out-of-control software bot. You know, it gets acquired, the company, it's built in a little company that does well, and that gets acquired by another company, and all the staff is dismissed, and they forget the passwords, and that gets acquired by another company. And there's a little bot asleep somewhere in the software of that company. It wakes up someday and just wipes it out. A book to read. Daniel Suarez just wrote a book, Daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N. And it paints a very vivid and terrifying scenario of what a world of stupid, ubiquitous bots can do. And I think it's a very frightening and very accurate description.
So I have a couple of general questions that I want to pose to the panel, and then I want to open it up to everybody's questions. Before I do that, do you have any suggestions on what we should do? I mean, are we inevitably headed for this sort of train wreck of scary bots coming alive, and or is there something we can do about it?
You know, we're gonna do what we always did, and that is muddle through somewhere in the middle. I mean, you know, as Kenneth suggested, we're gonna work out some details with the combat bots, and you know, Daniel implied this is a full employment act for corporate lawyers. You know, we're not headed into a nirvana, and it's not going to be hell. We'll work it out in the middle, but along the way, you know, innocent civilians will get killed, and robotic cars will get out of control. You know, the Toyota Prius has a really interesting problem right now. Some of their cars are behaving in whimsical, unpredictable ways. That, by the way, is the definition of life. Yeah. Something is, if you write software and it behaves in a whimsical, unpredictable way, the chances are it's some primitive life form.
Paul, I'm worried about this because I had never driven one of these before, and they rented this to me up at the San Francisco airport here. I've never driven a Prius, and it's not quite like anything else, actually. Yeah, okay, all right, now I understand.
Well, and cars, you know, Daniel's a pilot. Cars are going fly-by-wire. You know, today when you turn the wheel, there's a physical linkage tied to the tires. That will disappear very soon. And you'll turn the wheel, and sensors will pick up your intentions. That'll get filtered by the computer and then translated to instructions to the wheels. And trust me, you don't want to buy a low serial number.
So let me. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but let me open this same question up to Ken and to Dan. Do you have any thoughts about sort of what we can do to help to inoculate ourselves against the kind of problems that we might be seeing? I mean, are there things we can do in advance as lawyers, as citizens?
Well, I actually have, to a certain extent, the opposite concern. In the long run, I have the same kind of low probability, I hope, apocalyptic fears. But in the kind of mid-run, I'm more anxious. Right now in the United States, both as epitomized by the investing public's view towards failure in business and a lot of other things, we are at a peak anti-risk moment. I mean, people are just very risk averse. The concept of risk is bad. We have, you know, prominent politicians, somebody standing up saying, no company should fail. The company that fails is failing because people fail to pay attention. It's like, no, actually, companies fail because they're risky endeavors, and now it's bad to fail for wrong reasons, you know, of course, and we agree. So I'm worried about clearing a sufficient path for robotics to develop in a robust manner that doesn't kill it too soon in its infancy, and we don't do things, and the car example is a good one, right? There's a pretty straightforward fact which says soon enough, on average, you're going to take an average driver, you're going to take well-engineered autonomous vehicle, and you're going to say the autonomous vehicle is going to do better. It's just always going to do better. And yet there's this fear factor and risk factor, and one incident, which we'll have a hard time sorting out fault, frankly, probably, but one incident is going to kind of incite this, monster cars chasing small children in the streets. And I'm nervous that we need to, carve a path and avoid a crisis. So I would also mention that people's perception of what a robot is expanding beyond what robots maybe really are, but it doesn't matter. We shouldn't quibble over the definition. If someone sees something that they think is a robot and it does a bad thing, they're going to say robots are bad, even if it wasn't a robot.
And also, there's the reverse of this, which is people get emotionally attached to their robots already. As a forecaster, I look for indicators, weak signal indicators of things happening. And I noticed back in 2003 a really odd thing with some of my engineer friends here in Silicon Valley. They were totally stoked about their new robotic Roomba vacuum cleaners. And this was really odd because I couldn't even remember these guys owning vacuum cleaners. and then I would like bring them over and show them and stuff. And so I called up the folks at iRobot and I said, what are you all seeing? They said, it's a really weird thing. We've discovered that 2/3 of our Roomba owners are giving their robots names. Now, when did anybody ever give their vacuum cleaner a name? And 1/3 of Roomba owners admitted to having taken their robots on vacation with them or over to a friend's house to show off. And you're starting to see it with cars. I mean, you start putting a rudimentary intelligence in this, and we are programmed as a species to confer life to inanimate objects.
You can see that actually in the battlefield stuff.
Yes.
It's stunning to me, actually, because you have, since Peter Singer wrote about this, and you've got a not vast, but it's a significant number of soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and talking about ways in which their little Robbie the robot thing that goes out there and checks out the IED, they've developed a sufficient relationship with it that they're willing to risk their lives in order to make sure that Robbie doesn't get shot. This is, I think this is mad, actually, but it tells you something about the nature of this kind of interaction. But to go actually back to Ryan's question, I guess I wind up thinking that it is this question about not permitting enough risk in this in order to allow the technology to actually take root in various kinds of ways. And that one of the reasons that I think is likely to happen is that robots, I think, are going to be tied very closely to the aging and decline and death of the baby boom generation. I mean, me and mine. And that those of you who are student age, you're not actually going to want to take care of us. And strikingly, we will not actually want you to take care of us either. You mentioned the kindness of strangers, and I think that actually the odd part of it is the reason that we will turn to robots is because we don't actually want the kindness of strangers, and we actually prefer the kindness of a machine when it comes to things that are deeply sort of personal and involve loss of autonomy and involve my decline in my powers will lead me, frankly, to prefer a robot to deal with bathing and toileting and all that sort of stuff as I'm declining, rather than having any human wind up doing it. And that will put greater emphasis on the humanization of the robot, but will also put it in some way that feels much less threatening to me. And yet, at the same time, that's going to be, Grandpa Ken. And the moment that Grandpa Ken gets, electrocuted in the bath by, Robbie the robot.
When good robots go bad.
When good robots go bad, then it's going to start to feel a little bit more like Zombieland, right? And I think that my kid and my grandkids will wind up being much more risk averse when it's grandpa at stake, in a way that even though Grandpa Ken actually wanted the robot and preferred that kind of interaction and preferred to limit actual human interaction to people that I actually wanted to interact with.
We get leapfrogged then by other, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to comment on what Ken was saying, I teach forecasting to engineers here at Stanford. And last year we did a deep dive on the future of robotics. And every year I try and put up a straw question, pick the most outlandish question I can imagine and let the students loose on it and revisit it during term. And the question at the start of my course last year was, what year would we see the first legal case of a human suing for the right to marry their robot? And we all assumed, had a laugh and said, yeah, maybe sometime during the second term of the Jenna Bush administration, but which I hope never comes. But by the end of the course, the consensus of the students was that it would happen before 2020. And I'll spare you the details, but it completely spun me around. And by the way, if you check it out, you can, if you have a strong stomach, in Japan there are already weird attachments between otaku and their primitive audio animatronic love dolls. They take them on dates and take them to movies and the like. So this desire, what Kenneth said on the battlefield, the attachment that you get there is already happening in civilian life.
Let me expand. I mean, and a part of that, it's interesting you mentioned Japan. I think the kind of demographic dynamics will drive Japan to be an early adopter. And I was mentioning this to Ryan earlier today. I couldn't believe the name of the company that's done this, but you're probably aware of. There's an interesting company that's formed by a early and successful roboticist in Japan called, the company now is called Cyberdyne. Kid you not. And their product is HAL. Kid you not also. But the product is quite interesting. HAL stands for Hybrid Assistive Limb. And this is an interesting direction. If you think about people and their willingness to adopt new technologies and to accommodate frailty and other things, we're much more likely to engage in assistive devices than devices that assist us outright. And so it's an interesting, if you have a chance to look at this device online or in YouTube, they have videos of it. It's quite interesting. It's basically, a suit, but it's a very thin, and the profile's getting smaller and smaller. It's a suit that helps you. And the first people that will use it are those engaged in elder care, interestingly, because lifting people who are old, it's very hard, and it magnifies your strength 2 to 10 times. But then later, I think, and this is already being sold in Japan, not in other places, it's something that you wear, but it has fairly sophisticated systems on board, and those systems will become, I imagine, only more sophisticated, such that if you, for example, pass out, let's pretend, so this isn't capable yet, but in a few years I bet it will be. If you lose consciousness, I suspect it will eventually, take you somewhere, which would be a little freaky to see, right? So, door opens, there's someone unconscious being, motored down the road.
Zombieland. This is Zombieland.
So these are, I think, those are the early adoption, and I think it's going to be incremental. It isn't as startling to see someone wearing something strange, right, as it is to see someone being carried by a robot. I think that's more startling to the conscious.
Can I ask actually something, Paul, in this, in the sort of, you sort of name off these phases of sort of projecting into the future. I would have made a guess that what comes after robots might be various forms of cyborgs. And what I mean by that is not necessarily, it might involve this sort of assistive stuff where it actually gets fused into you in some way. So in other words,
Same thing, but on the inside.
Same thing, but on the inside, so that you become, part. But I think that it also might wind up being other kinds of living organisms as well that are adapted with these things. I mean, one reason I think of this is because in the war field, in the fighting areas, that sort of stuff, one of the things being looked at is it's the moth that we're now able to take and implant the electrodes and steer it this way or steer it that way. Well, I think that what we're looking at in the defense field is the ability to attach a little camera to that and fly it around and send it where we want. And after that, we're going to attach a very tiny bomb to it so that we can fly up to Ryan, say, he's the one, boom, right? So fly up and say, it is Ryan, boom.
Thanks for picking on Ryan.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. So I sort of wonder whether if you were to look even one step beyond sort of strictly robotics, whether something like cyborgization would be.
Oh yeah, no,
next
there's, and the military really is the leading edge here. It's, you look at prosthetics. Hugh Herr's work at MIT with powered prosthetics and the like. I'm just waiting for the first murder case where someone said, it was my artificial arm that did it. It wasn't me, and it was the software. Should we take questions from the
Yeah, I was
audience?
going to say, exactly.
We'll shut up and you ask
Yeah,
questions.
shut up. No, but seriously, I'd love to be able to open it up to questions here. Right before we do that, I wanted to just say something quickly while I got a chance. Was that I just learned this today? But did you guys know that the American Bar Association has a science and tech law, course, overarching thing? They actually have a committee on AI and robotics. And it turns out that Stephen Wu is actually right there. He's got his hand up. If you're interested in this, he is the chair-elect of that particular section, and would love to talk to people about it. I was amazed and fascinated and heartened that that's happening. It's a great thing.
Just a comment. One thing that was once on my mind listening to all this is before we
Yeah.
make a doctor's proposal.
Sorry, yeah, just wait for the microphone because this is being recorded. So
Okay. One
Several
thing,
thousand robots listening as you
yeah.
one thing that was going through my mind listening to the panel was the need for a remake of Dr. Strangelove. You're invited.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a fine film and it should be redone. It's interesting you say that because robots have been around for a lot longer than we realize. The first atomic bomb dropped in anger over Hiroshima was actually not dropped by a human. That moments as they approached the AP, the Aoi Bridge, and the bombardier got it in the sight, he handed it off to an electromechanical machine to do the dropping. So, strictly speaking, no human dropped the atomic bomb. The plane was put on automatic, and Tibbets just sat there with his hands off, and it did the whole thing, and then they skedaddled out. So, we haven't even told the full Strangelove story yet.
And that was an electromechanical machine that we considered so valuable that the last thing that an officer was supposed to do if the plane was going down was to fire a flare into it so it would melt it down. Or if they crashed and survived, they were to sacrifice their life in an effort to prevent it from falling into enemy hands.
People are already dying for their
Already?
robots.
Yeah. Question.
Oh, there's a question in the front, Mr.
I get confused. It seems to me there are really three major groups. One is the sort of mechanical amplifier type machine. And that's sort of what the Predator is, in my mind, or the bomb disposal. Then there is the fly-by-wire type machine, which really acts as an intermediary. It doesn't really think. It does do some interesting things, but it's really not autonomous. And then there's the true iRobot automaton, which basically you say, make it happen and come away later, and it's happened. And it seems to me that the law and the way those impact me thoughtfully, etc., are really different in those three areas. There's slop over. But do you apply robot to all three of them? Are they different?
I guess I do think of those as being very different in terms of the legal issues they raise. So within the military context, anything that involves an actual live human being controlling it in real time raises one set of issues. And anything that involves genuine autonomy in terms of the decision to acquire a target and fire and to assess, is something that in the military context is hugely important. What's the damage to everybody else? That second is a really different set of issues and an entirely different legal set of issues that's not raised by the first. And the assumption has generally been that it's the second of these that raises the greatest levels of difficulty for the law and more generally ethics and sort of figuring out how to deal with this kind of thing. It's interesting to me that when I put that question to a well-known robot computer scientist in this who's been working on exactly these kinds of issues, and his response was, you keep telling me that these questions about targeting and collateral damage are so hard, and he said, but I'm not looking for perfection in this. I'm only looking to do as well as you do as human beings. So you tell me what you do as human beings, and I'll have the robot do the same thing. And I still don't think it's exactly as easy as that. But I think those are where the questions are going to go. And I think you're quite right to separate out these things. I think the legal questions are radically different.
I love the taxonomy. I think you're spot on. And I would just note, to me, the threshold is that the device is autonomous for some period of time. It sort of goes back to the definition, the original meaning of robot from Karl Čapek's play, RUR. Ironically, the truly autonomous robots are not in the military situation. The military has actually done a pretty good job at keeping track of their robots. It's in things like the Tokyo subway system. When they started automating the Tokyo subway system in the 90s, they kept an operator there with his hand on a dead man switch on the train until they discovered that accidents by the human operator were causing more troubles, that they took the operator out of the train. So there are huge swaths, basically the entire Tokyo train system runs automatically with no human control. You all, if you're driving through San Francisco, the traffic system is all running completely autonomously. So, and that to me is the frontier where it's set up and people completely forget about it.
Let me make a suggestion, which is there's the possibility that as in some cases with computing, that eventually the capacity of the machines that we build becomes so strong that everything has autonomy as a potential, but we just dumb it down or we constrain it. And I think in some ways that's how you might want to look at it over the mid-run, which is everything has a certain amount of autonomy, but what we're asking is what's the range and scope of potential action. And so the fly-by-wire device has very narrow scope of action. It's on a plane. It's only in certain circumstances that matters, but it does matter. At a certain point, it steps up and says, I'm doing something because of inputs I received, action I take, and there will be output, which is I prevent someone. So stopping somebody from doing something I think counts as action. And then at the same time, if you take the assistive device, I think eventually assistive devices will be fully automated, but we just won't activate the automation and the scope of free action unless, again, take the unconscious example. If it measures the fact that the person is dying or unconscious, then it turns on. So I think in the end, some of those divisions actually conflate. And not right now.
Your comment about boundary conditions is what matters. Where we get in trouble is where we define the envelope wrong. So let me wipe some serial numbers off this example so I don't get in too much trouble since we're being taped. There was a certain large aircraft company, and they had a fly-by-wire plane, and it was sitting on the tarmac, and the engines were idling because they were doing weight tests with the plane, and they'd forgotten to put a tail mast on it so that the tail wouldn't settle back. And the weight shifted, and the plane settled back, and the software on the plane went, oh, right. If airspeed is below such a speed and angle of attack is greater than such a speed, gun the engines.
I thought it was stalling.
And it kind of jumped like a big puppy dog over a bunch of luggage carts and then sat there and said, didn't I do good?
All right, let's go on to the next question. I think we had...
I just have a follow-up if you don't
please.
mind.
Yeah, no, of course.
Because the cases that you talked about are certainly very interesting and within range. But what about when we reach genuine autonomy, namely machines with motivation, and their own sort of concept of self, which, huh?
It does its own thing.
Well, you saw the soccer players, right, chasing the ball, and when they look down and see their arms around the ball, they have no idea that is their arm. So they don't really have self-awareness in that sense, and everything they do is pre-scripted. They choose when they adopt a certain behavior, depending on, the run of play, but they don't have full autonomy in any sense, okay? And a lot of the systems that you've been talking about don't either. So that's the discontinuity when machines develop their own genuine motivation. So then what happens? What laws do we have? What's going to break?
Well, I think there's a meeting in the middle. There are neuroscientists who are already demonstrating that humans actually have a lot less autonomy than we realize. And so somewhere in there, we're going to realize we're a lot more programmed than we realize, and the robots are going to be more autonomous than we.
Well, I think our regime for truck versus temporary employee starts to kick in pretty quickly. Someone is responsible for this motivated agent, and for a while that serves us pretty well because we'll still have boundaries. We all have boundaries, right? You step into the building and you do work for Stanford, and Stanford's actually on the hook for whatever it is you do, all things considered, unless you go outside the building. And even if we have motivation autonomy, we will still have, metaphorical at least, buildings in which we constrain folks.
Yeah, but
for a while.
what happens when
We better
things
get
go
some
wrong?
more questions in.
Yeah,
It'll
we should
be
get some more
midnight.
questions in.
Okay,
I
so
think
can we have 3 more, or do we have to wrap up? Or
Yeah, as many
How
as
many,
we have time. We have
how
until
many
8
people have
o'clock,
questions?
so-
Everybody with questions, raise your hand.
We go till 8.
One,
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
All right, I think.
Okay.
Let's do 5 and call it.
Try and be quick.
That's all right.
I think, weren't we supposed to go till 8 or something?
Yeah, just tying into the title of the panel, legal challenges in the age of robotics. What are the legal challenges? Does all of this work within the existing legal framework, or should we be anticipating changes in the legal system? Thoughts?
Well, Ryan should answer a question about liability.
Yeah,
issues.
so
I
I-
think it's a very good one.
I
that
mean,
he's the expert in.
I'm not, so I'm the moderator here, but I have a thought on this. So I think that for a lot of the reasons we've talked about on the liability front, I think we're going to need to think about how to immunize manufacturers in appropriate circumstances. Because if we don't do that, I think we're going to really progress too slowly in robotics and, in fact, get eclipsed by other places that are already ahead of us. And the scenario I envision is one where we're building these more and more autonomous robots with lots of different functionality. Something goes terribly wrong. It involves some sympathetic plaintiff, and inevitably they go after, say, the deep pockets of the manufacturer. My idea that I've been thinking about has to do with looking at the experience of the internet, where Section 230 of the CDA immunizes individual platforms for the activities of their users. So, except in certain circumstances, users' conduct, say defamation, will not be attributed to the platform. Well, there's a ready analog to robotics where often it's a matter of programming, it's a matter of how you use it, there's even modular robots that you can change and adopt, you can add things. And I think that having a kind of Section 230 immunity for robotics would help keep capital and people flowing to the area. I think that the legal challenges, to answer your question more specifically, have everything to do with foreseeability in tort, right? There's just really complex systems with lots of inputs. And even there's this specter of autonomy swelling, right? And to the extent that the law cares very deeply about foreseeability of things, it's just not possible to do, really, with robotics, or at least in the kind of idealized version of robotics we want. And so I think one of the major legal challenges is handling this difference between the operator and the manufacturer.
And in fact,
Please, no.
I was going to say, one way to anticipate the problems that will arise in the law in a particularly shocking way is to look, I think, at Paul's kind of system of thinking, the processors, the networking, and then the sensors. And the example that drew me in part to this that comes from corporate governance is, imagine, we know these algorithms exist, a very sophisticated machine in a very large hedge fund, and their goal is to gather as much information as broadly and as quickly as possible and process it. So first, massive amounts of data, that's processor. But then networking, right? How is it that you're able to go out and gather so much? Well, it's the networking of all these machines. And then the sensors part kicks in and is really interesting to me, because let's imagine that you empower an artificial agent that is designed to gather information on lightly traded but publicly traded companies such that interesting or hard to find information is going to make a big difference. And one of the things you do is in public spaces, you engage in a strategy to gather massive amounts of information. So you follow the people who work for the company to the Starbucks where they talk, right? So the sensor part, which we aren't accustomed to thinking, we get the processor. We understand that you can throw lots of data and computers do a better job of sorting it. We kind of get the networking where everything is connected. We haven't thought through the sensor part yet. So imagine all of those exaggerations being applied to that. You gather all that information in, and that system trades on it. We aren't ready to deal with that in securities law, for example. I mean, is that insider trading? Well, no. Who breached their duty? Who's the tipper? Who's the tippy? None of it works. It just kind of, so the fact patterns, because the abilities are exaggerated by these three phenomena, I think are going to challenge us pretty quickly. But what's interesting to me is if you get a bunch of people in a room, you can anticipate a lot of this and start working at how to categorize them into what we do have so that we can iterate some of the approach. And a lot of this stuff in this space goes to Delaware courts. And the Delaware courts, interestingly, are interested in keeping up in a way that other courts are not. And so, and not to disparage the other courts, but Delaware has a franchise to preserve to keep up with what happens in some of these contexts. So I think there's hope. We just got to think about it in advance.
I could just add to that. I think this point about sensors and robotics points to a very big area that we haven't really covered in this discussion, but really should, which is the question about privacy and surveillance. Because when I look at this from a battlefield standpoint, the greatest virtue of robotics at this moment is not really weapons. The greatest virtue is the ability to gather detailed information from a variety of streams about where the bad guys are. And what we would like to see happen in the design of that would be swarms of tiny little camerized insect-like things that can fly out there, fly into the buildings, figure out in a detailed way. We've got the computing power to be able to absorb all those data streams, but what makes it robotics rather than computation is you add the sensor part to this, and then you add the mobility part, right? And then you add an autonomy part that raises a third part. But even leaving the autonomy part off at this point, sensors that are now mobile is what you're getting at when you talk about the ability to gather this securities law data. On the battlefield, I can't tell you how thrilled I am about that, because that's how you identify the targets and get out of getting all the non-targets. If we're talking about the rest of social life and all of that, then I think you've got a really, really big problem in the nature of surveillance and privacy and stuff that was taken for granted that we don't care about. We don't care about, we protect the rights of the photographer to photograph people on the street and say that's part of, my wife is a photographer and that's what she does. But if you had stuff that was simply, even purely private, just grabbing everybody's images all the time, it completely alters the nature of that, and that I think is actually a huge area.
So I want to make sure we have room for at least another couple of questions. Yeah, Stephen, before we do, I just want to mention a report people might be interested in. A very recent report revealed that all the kinds of personal robotics that we already have in our, potentially in our homes, that is, that you can already buy, I think it's I can't remember the name of it, but the Rovio and these other things like that, that they're really, really easy to hack. Okay, so you pull up your car into the thing, right? And it's sort of obvious, right? I mean, Ed Felton's like, yeah. But so that not only can you make this thing go around and look at the inside of a house, but you can actually get it to vandalize a house, right? You come home and your house is trashed because some kid drove into your parking lot, hacked your personal robot, and destroyed your house. And so,
Glenn, it goes one step further than that, because they're now putting wireless devices into things like your heart valve and things like that, and they're discovering that those can now be hacked as well, and
Wow.
that's kind of really scary.
that is extremely scary. All right, Stephen.
And that's a good segue into my question, which is, have any of you thought about the convergence of artificial intelligence and information technology and nanotechnology on one hand, and life sciences and neurosciences on the other, with concepts like the brain to IT connection, where you can use that connection to magnify the powers of your brains using IT, and the legal implications of that?
Sure, we're real close to it already. We're already doing body mods with biotechnology that people are doing to improve performance. Tommy John surgery for baseball players, rethreading a tendon. It turns out they do it when they blow their arm out, but they discovered they could pitch better than they could beforehand. Why am I going blank on his name? There's an English researcher.
The chip guy.
Yeah, he's already put RFID chips under his arms. And I would invite you all to look at the whole body mod subculture. These are people who do things like subcutaneous coral, to grow horns on your head. It's way beyond piercings. There's one woman I know who embedded a little magnet the size of about half the size of an aspirin under her fingertip. And thanks to the miracle of neural remapping, it would move in the presence of electrical fields, and she can tell when a wire is energized, and swears that she can detect the sensors in museums when she walks in. So the crossover from computers to bio, in my opinion, is, the optimists say we're going to build a human brain by 2030, and that as we look at the curve of Moore's law, that we'll get the circuit density of a human brain in a human size by then, but it'll be biological. So it's already starting to happen, and look at the prosthetics work, Hugh Hare and his activated machines. I don't know about you all, as someone who went to college in the 70s and had to worry about the library being open late enough to finish my homework class, it really ticks me off with my students, that little the little darlings have access to the web 24 hours a day. But some future generation of students in the next couple of decades will have implantable electronic memory supplements, guaranteed.
I would just, this is partly what I was driving at when I mentioned cyborgs as being the sort of the wave after that. If you ask me what I think socially will be the driver for that, my older brother is a neuropsychiatrist, and he says that if he were 30 years younger, he would go in and open a practice which would simply be about basically performance enhancement. And he said, and I said, well, aren't there going to be sort of problems with how you get permissions to do that and get drugs applied to it? And he said, well, we'll call it all Alzheimer's research. He said that basically the driver for this will be people in their prime who want to have additional edges on this, but the way that will be justified and brought about will be actually by dealing with dementia.
Read the comments on YouTube's videos about the HAL 5 machine. It's really, and I was like, oh, that's crazy. But then when I saw it was only $4,000, I'm like, I could maybe buy one of those. I mean, you have this sense. I mean, this desire to perform in this remarkable way is
people
very
are
strong.
already implanting machines in their skull today. They're called cochlear implants. And there is absolutely no reason why you can't design a cochlear implant to hear into the high ultrasonic or go down into infrasound and hear approaching earthquakes. And I guarantee it will happen.
Yeah, and if the law, and to answer your earlier question, if the law ends up recognizing, saying you have no expectations of privacy, right, where you're in public, this augmentation of human beings in terms of their memory and their ability to sense could shift your expectations as well.
2 minutes and 2 questions left.
Yeah, exactly. There's a problem with robotics in the law is that you can't get people to stop talking about it.
Ryan touched on this just a minute ago, but I'd really like to hear more about the security of these robotic systems against intrusion. If you could talk a little bit about the liability or regulatory issues involved. I mean, clearly there are military concerns about penetration of their systems, but also how do we prevent and what happens when a botnet transfers from my computer to a phone to a Prius? And what's our survivability in a world where viruses and spam on the internet have entered into our real life?
Okay, one of you guys answer that in 1 minute.
So I think there are issues of security and reliance, right? So people will over-rely on systems that were never designed to do a certain thing that they come to expect it to do, and then they will underestimate the penetrability of any number of systems, both first, I think we'll see it early with privacy issues, then we'll see it with vandalism issues, then we'll see it with life-threatening issues. And I think that that'll be an area in which there are two simultaneous threats. Not addressing it at the design level and sufficiently communicating and creating expectations will make people very unsatisfied with an entire industry, which would be a bad phase. But even more interesting to me is that there's no clear regulatory body. And I think we can look at the Segway as an interesting example. If you look at what happened at the town council reaction level to Segways in certain places, you had these crazy debates where like, these dangerous machines will kill toddlers on the sidewalk, we must ban them all, right? And I think if the notion of anticipating potential pain points that consumers will have in a very loud way, and then anticipating which agencies might want to regulate, if we can do that now, in advance of the crisis or the big headline, we will be able to navigate the issue of all the regulatory agencies jumping in at once, right? I mean, because you can imagine robotics implicates about 7 or 8 key regulatory areas, and the last thing you want is local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, and 7 regulatory agencies all swooping down after having not paid it any attention. So I think that it's incumbent on the industry itself to try to set articulated standards and expectations, because all of these technologies will be fallible at a fundamental level, and I think people should not rely on them too soon, too much.
I think we have one last question. Well, it's coming down. I want to say that the reason why Segway failed was that people look like dopes when they're on them.
Soon you'll be able to detach your leg and just detach. Roll along.
So I'm curious about the definition of robots that we've been playing with, and could one extend it to even something as broad as a robotic university in school that was web-based, where it might sense, think, and act, perhaps in the way that would be responsive, Wikipedia-like, to all of our inputs. So the action might be that a world university and school that is growing would be to provide content somehow through video or interactively. And threshold, and so this is thinking, using Wikipedia as a model. Does Wikipedia have sensing, thinking, and acting? And does it have its own agency in some ways? I'm not sure and vis-a-vis the law is Creative Commons law as perhaps a contrast to corporate governance law, open-ended in that same way.
Let me do the 30-second and then let Paul finish it off, because I think you might have a more interesting comment on this. At least I think you do. I think it's interesting when you turn it on its head and you say, can the acting and the augmentation be the agent seeking humans to do the acting and to do the augmentation? And it's actually the other way around. We become the assistive device to whatever it is you're talking about. I think Wikipedia doesn't quite achieve that, because I don't think it autonomously seeks out augmentation on its own. That's still human guided. But you can imagine a system that somehow, and take the trading system that huge hedge funds may use. One simple thing makes it even more interesting, and that is you give it the power to go onto Amazon Mechanical Turk and to engage in purchasing of certain actions by any number of anonymous agents to augment its gathering. And you could create games and prizes to find certain trash or litter that was on a certain block because that there was discarded information. You could do any sorts of things. And as soon as the AI or entity does that, I think you have your interesting story where you have a self-perpetuating entity that in turn uses us, right, pays us a little bit to do interesting things and augment it. I think that'll happen sooner rather than later. And actually, there's evidence that maybe something like that is happening. I mean, the best proprietary stuff that's doing the trading and active engagement for gathering information, we don't know much about. I mean, there's people paid more than all of us in the room. Who,
Neither do the software designers.
well, yeah.
So
Somebody's-
Paula, last
sorry.
word here.
Build on what Dan said. What you're talking about is what in the AI community is called AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, distinguished from narrow AI. Narrow AI would be very narrow, domain-specific, like program trading. And by the way, I like your scenario. It'd make a good short story. There's a school of thought that as the network keeps getting more and more complex, we will spontaneously have the emergence of an intelligence in the network. It's like the old joke that when the UNIVAC was first turned on and the scientists said, well, let's ask it a question, and they typed, is there a God? And the machine flashed its lights and word and paused, and then the card came out and it said, there is one now. Researchers like Ben Goertzel think that's highly unlikely. But I do think there are two possibilities. One is I would be surprised if we didn't have, sort of hark back to Jeremy Bentham and, the notions of the law machine, some really powerful expert system that in unbelievably complex cases, I mean, if you can't understand the underlying cause and effect, that you may have to ask an expert system. But I'll give you a forecast. The first place you all will encounter a human-scale artificial intelligence, something that will convincingly fool you, is going to be in an online game. That's where all the money's going right now, is building software robots that can be just so compelling, they'll completely hook you in a game. And the first time someone falls in love with a software bot on a game, that's when you know it's over.
All right. On that, that's our last word. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the panelists.